Imagine, just for a second, this huge global system. We're talking over $200 billion flowing through it every year. It shapes nations, employs millions, and, people compare it to the military-industrial complex. That's how big, how embedded it is.
It's a powerful comparison.
But right now, that whole system, it's facing, well, unprecedented disruption. And it really makes you think, what if the very system designed to help is actually maybe locking people into dependency?
It's a tough question, but a really important one right now.
So this deep dive, we're tackling exactly that. The 8 industrial complex, the AIC, we want to look at the whole ecosystem, governments, NGOs, contractors, all of it.
Right.
And we're drawing heavily on Ali Al Mokdad's report today, which really gets into the nitty-gritty. Our mission is to boil down this super complex topic, give you the key insights, basically a shortcut to understanding what's really going on behind the scenes with global aid.
Getting past the surface level.
Exactly. So the big question we're wrestling with is this whole system just fundamentally inefficient, maybe even self-serving? Or is this massive disruption we're seeing actually a chance, maybe a rare chance, to rebuild global aid completely?
A crisis or an opportunity? Or maybe both.
Okay, let's try and unpack it. Where do we even start trying to define this AIC thing? What is it, really?
It's, like you said, a sprawling global ecosystem. Think of it as this massive network. You've got the big government donors, USAID from the U.S., FCDO from the U.K., you know the type.
Yeah.
Then the huge multilateral players like the World Bank, different UN agencies. Then, of course, the big international NGOs, Oxfam, Save the Children, those names everyone knows.
Yeah.
Plus, increasingly private foundations. But also, and this is key, the private contractors, firms like Chemonics, DAI. They're doing a lot of the actual work.
Right, the implementers.
Exactly. And universities, think tanks, even new donors like China emerging. It's this incredibly complex web.
And the scale is just mind-boggling. Over $200 billion a year in official aid, plus all the private charity money on top.
It's immense.
It covers everything, right? Humanitarian relief, long-term development projects. It even gets tangled up in foreign policy.
Absolutely. It serves multiple agendas, often simultaneously.
But here's the rub, the core criticism, that despite all the good intentions, the system itself is maybe broken, full of inefficiencies, self-serving loops.
That's the heart of the critique, yes, that it can end up perpetuating dependency, especially in the global south, rather than building real self-reliance.
So that comparison to the military-industrial complex, it's not just rhetoric, it points to a system that might be more focused on its own survival than its mission.
I think that's what the critics are suggesting. It highlights that potential for a deeply entrenched, self-sustaining structure. For you listening, that's a key takeaway. It's not just about the money, it's about the system itself.
And that system is really being shaken right now. You mentioned disruption. Tell us about that.
Well, the numbers are stark. Global Official Development Assistance, ODA, it actually dropped by 7.1% in 2024.
Wow, 7.1% after years of growth.
Exactly. First decline in 6 years. That's a significant shockwave.
What's behind such a big drop?
We saw some really dramatic policy shifts. President Trump's executive order in January 2025, for example, a 90-day aid freeze.
Okay.
But it wasn't just a pause. It led to the actual dissolution of USAI. 86% of its programs canceled, headquarters shut down, thousands of people laid off.
Dissolving USA. Canceling 86% of programs, that's seismic. Was the U.S. alone in this?
No, not at all. It triggered or maybe coincided with similar moves elsewhere. Germany cut $5.3 billion. The UK slashed aid by 40%. The Netherlands, 37%.
Good grief.
You add it all up, the projection for 2025 was a loss of somewhere between $41 and $60 billion. That's like 15 to 22% of total global ODA. Gone.
That is a massive hole. It really does feel like the end of aid as we know it, or at least the aid system we've known. How are people making sense of this?
Well, it cuts both ways. On the one hand, you have warnings of real humanitarian crises. The Danish Refugee Council talked about untold suffering and deaths. UNRWA in Gaza pushed to the absolute brink.
Understandable. The human cost.
Absolutely. But on the other hand, this massive shock, this crisis, it also blows the doors open for rethinking everything. Maybe moving away from the old models towards things like industrialization, local fiscal autonomy, really strengthening South-South cooperation.
So the system's in shock, and that might be the only way to force fundamental change.
It's a possibility. Crises often create those rare moments where the previously unthinkable becomes possible.
It's a fascinating, if scary, dynamic, but it makes me wonder why the AIC got this way. Why this complex, self-preserving nature. The theories behind it are really illuminating here.
They really are. One of the foundational lenses is dependency theory. Thinkers like Andre Gunder Frank, Samir Amin, they argued quite controversially at the time that aid often doesn't develop poor countries.
It does the opposite.
It can, yes, by reinforcing these unequal economic relationships, the core, the wealthy global north, and the periphery, the global south. Tied aid is the classic example.
Explain that a bit more.
Sure. Tied aid is when a donor country gives aid, but with the condition that the recipient has to buy goods or services from companies in the donor country.
Ah, so the money flows back.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It props up the donor's economy, can saddle the recipient with debt, and limits their choices. It reinforces that dependency.
Okay, that makes sense. What other lenses help explain this?
Well, then you have post-colonial aid discourse. Thinkers like Escobar, Kapoor, they look at development aid as a kind of modern echo of colonial governance.
Also,
The language used saving, capacity building, bringing expertise, it can sound helpful, but it often masks a paternalistic approach. It imposes northern ideas, northern solutions, often ignoring or overriding local knowledge and priorities.
so it's about power dynamics, not just money.
Precisely. You see it in how international NGOs or Western consultants often dominate projects, even when local groups have far more context.
Interesting. So dependency, post-colonial echoes. What else?
A really powerful lens, I think, is complex adaptive systems thinking. This views the AIC not as a static machine, but as this living, evolving network.
Okay, like an ecosystem.
Exactly like an ecosystem.
Yeah.
It has incredible resilience. It has feedback loops. It has this sort of innate drive to preserve itself.
How does that play out?
Well, think about it. A program might fail, objectively fail. But paradoxically, that failure can lead to more funding.
How does that work?
The argument becomes, well, the problem is bigger than we thought. We need more resources to fix it properly. So failure reinforces the system, keeps the money flowing, keeps the organizations running.
Wow.
And those 2025 aid cuts we talked about, the system adapted. Organizations downsized, they subcontracted more, they found ways to maintain influence even with less money. It showed the resilience in action.
So if the system is that good at adapting and surviving, does it mean small reforms are pointless? Does it take a massive shock like 2025 to actually change anything fundamental?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? This perspective suggests that maybe yes, that incremental tweaks might just get absorbed by the system without changing its core logic. Real transformation might need those big tipping points.
It paints a picture of something far more complex than just a bunch of organizations doing good work. It really is this interdependent web, employing millions, you said, mostly in donor countries.
Absolutely. That employment aspect is huge. USAI, before the cuts, had over 9,400 staff. A lot of those jobs are in administration, contracting, oversight, roles based in Washington or other donor capitals.
Which creates its own incentive to keep the system going.
It certainly contributes to that self-sustaining loop. High-paying jobs depending on the continuation of aid flows.
Okay, let's drill down into the specific players in this web. How do they interact? Let's start with the obvious ones. Donor governments, US, UK, Japan, Germany. They provide the bulk of the money.
They do. They set the overall policy direction, decide where the big priorities lie. But as we mentioned, that funding is rarely purely altruistic.
Right, strategic interests play a big role.
A huge role. Security alliances, trade relationships, geopolitical influence. It's all mixed in. Think about U.S. aid historically.
Yeah.
Big chunks go to strategic allies like Israel and Egypt.
And the critique of these big government agencies.
Often it's about bureaucracy. They can be slow, risk-averse, and they tend to favor working with other large organizations, big international contractors, rather than smaller local groups. Easier to manage large grants, perhaps.
Okay. What about the big multilateral institutions? The UN agencies, the World Bank, where do they fit?
They're crucial nodes. They pool funding from multiple donors, coordinate global initiatives, lend legitimacy, think large-scale health programs or development banks.
But they face criticism too.
Oh, yes. High overhead costs are a frequent complaint, sometimes up to 30% just for administration, bureaucracy again, and sometimes using generic one-size-fits-all approaches that don't quite fit the local context.
30% overhead. Wow.
And their vulnerability was really exposed in 2025. When major donors pulled back funding, UN agencies had to suspend work in over 20 countries. Shows how reliant they are on that northern financing.
Then you have the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, everyone from huge global brands like Oxfam down to small community groups. They're the ones actually delivering a lot of the projects, right?
They are absolutely central to delivery. They often have the community reach, the agility that larger bodies lack.
But there are issues there too.
Definitely. A big one is the funding structure. They're often reliant on short-term grants from donors. This creates intense competition for funding NGOs fighting each other for contracts.
The bid factories you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. It can lead to fragmentation, short-term thinking. And then there's the issue of staffing. Heavy reliance on expatriate staff, often paid much, much more, 3 to 5 times more than local counterparts doing similar work.
That must create tension.
It distorts local job markets, can undermine local leadership, reinforces that feeling of external control. Though, it's fair to say, there are NGOs trying to change this, focusing on genuine partnership, like Partners in Health working with the Rwandan government.
Now, this is interesting. The private contractors. Firms like Chemonics, DAI, you said they handle a huge chunk of the implementation, especially for agencies like USI.
A massive chunk. The source material mentioned 90% of USAID funds in 2022 went through private implementers, mostly US-based ones.
And they get called Beltway bandits. Why?
That term implies they leverage their connections, their proximity to Washington, D.C., to win these big, often very profitable contracts. The criticism is that they prioritize profit and contract fulfillment over actual development impact.
And the evidence for that?
Well, that 2025 audit finding was pretty damning. 43% of contractor projects failed to meet their main objectives, yet the companies got paid in full.
43% failure, full payment. That really highlights a problem with incentives.
It really does. And it shows how the system can reward activity over outcomes. When the funding taps were turned off in 2025, some of these firms faced bankruptcy, showing how dependent the model was on continuous government contracts.
So with all these international players, where do the recipient governments and local organizations fit in? Shouldn't they be in the driver's seat?
Ideally, yes. But often, they get sidelined. Donors might bypass government systems, preferring to work directly with NGOs or contractors, maybe due to concerns about corruption or capacity.
But that creates its own problems.
Absolutely. It can create parallel systems, undermine the government's ability to deliver services itself, and weaken state capacity in the long run. It prevents them from building their own sustainable systems.
Though you mentioned Rwanda as a counterexample.
Right. Rwanda shows that when aid is aligned with strong national ownership and government plans, you can get much better, more lasting results. Contrast that with Malawi, where aid historically made up 40% of the budget, huge vulnerability to donor agendas.
What about private foundations like Gates? They're huge players now.
Immensely powerful. They bring billions to the table, often targeting specific areas like global health or agriculture. They can be agile, innovative, take risks traditional donors might avoid.
But the critique?
Lack of transparency and public accountability. They're essentially private entities wielding enormous public influence. Their priorities, while often laudable, might reflect elite perspectives rather than grassroots needs.
And then the emerging donors, China, India, they're changing the game.
Significantly. China's Belt and Road Initiative is massive, dispersing maybe $40–50 billion a year. Their model often involves fewer governance conditions attached to loans or investments, but strong ties to Chinese companies.
Which raises concerns about debt.
Yes, debt sustainability is a major concern for recipient countries. India's approach is different, more focused on technical cooperation, lines of credit often framed as South partnership, mutual benefit. It offers an alternative to the traditional Western aid model.
And beyond these main groups, you've got think tanks, universities, tech firms raising worries about digital colonialism, faith groups, diaspora networks sending remittances that often dwarf official aid.
It's this incredibly dense ecosystem. And as Danella Meadows described it, it functions as a system with self-reinforcing feedback loops. Meaning the internal dynamics keeping funding flowing, maintaining institutional survival, meeting donor reporting requirements can sometimes become more important than achieving measurable long-term impact on the ground. Accountability gets blurry. For you, the listener, understanding this web of players and their incentives is crucial to understanding why the aid system often behaves in ways that seem counterintuitive.
Okay, let's follow the money, as they say. Because the political economy of how aid is funded tells a really critical part of this story. You mentioned something startling earlier, less than 10% of USAID's budget actually reaching the communities.
Yes, according to the source material analysis. In 2022, it suggests 90% of USAID spending went to international actors, contractors, NGOs, UN agencies, and over half of that went to just 10 large US-based organizations.
90% not reaching the community directly. Where does it go?
A lot of it gets caught up in what's called phantom aid, or the boomerang effect. A significant chunk cycles back to the donor country's economy.
Wow.
through contracts for goods and services bought from donor country companies, shipping costs on donor country vessels, salaries for international staff, administrative overhead back home. That U.S. food aid example is stark. 70% spent on domestic procurement and shipping between 2010 and 2020.
Inflating costs by 30% just to send the money back home.
Right. It makes the aid less efficient, and it can hurt local farmers and markets in the recipient country. Even when aid isn't formally tied anymore, these informal practices still reduce its effectiveness, maybe by 15–30%.
And the salary gaps you mentioned. An expat manager earning $140,000 versus a local counterpart making $42,000 or less.
Yeah, the disparities are huge. While sometimes justified by security costs or hardship allowances, they absolutely reinforce those hierarchies we talked about. It feels like, and often is, an externally driven system.
And that money gets diverted from actual programs.
Studies suggest those salary premiums can eat up maybe 25% of personnel budgets that could otherwise go to activities. It creates understandable resentment and reinforces the U.S. versus them dynamic. You have to think about how that feels if you're the local staff member, seeing those resources flow outwards.
Beyond the boomerang effect, how political is the allocation of aid? Is it really about need or more about strategy?
It's very often driven by geopolitics. Think about Afghanistan. After 2001, $145 billion in civilian aid flowed in, largely driven by U.S. security concerns, not standard development metrics.
Right.
In 2024, almost 40% of U.S. bilateral aid went to just 5 strategically important countries, including Israel, Egypt, Ukraine. And there's even research showing that how a country votes in the UN General Assembly can correlate with getting 10–20% more aid.
So it really is a foreign policy tool as much as a development tool.
It often functions that way, yes. Which leads to this idea that the whole sector has shifted from maybe cooperation to intense competition.
NGOs, contractors, UN agencies, all fighting for the same pot of money.
Pretty much. For-profit contractors have massively increased their market share, capturing 22% of global ODA implementation funds now, up from just 8% in 2005. They're often faster, better at branding, even if accountability is weaker.
Which turns NGOs into those bid factories.
Exactly. Less social justice movement, more proposal writing machines. It erodes collaboration. Local groups often become just subcontractors, implementing someone else's plan without real input. And in places like Gaza, when politics led the U.S. and EU to suspend UNRWA funding, it directly hit services for millions. Humanitarian neutrality gets compromised.
And underpinning all this is that complex structure: field offices, country offices, regional hubs, HQs back in donor capitals.
Right, this global employment engine. But the funding is often short-term, project-based. So organizations are constantly chasing the next grant, which incentivizes them to focus on visibility, keeping donors happy, ensuring institutional survival.
Rather than maybe long-term impact or local ownership.
That's the risk. Plus, the sheer burden of compliance audits. Reporting can consume 15–25% of budgets. So for you listening, the key insight is the system's structure creates incentives that often favor keeping the machine running, aligning with donor priorities, what's fundable, over perhaps what's most impactful, and can sometimes lead to this aid addiction where local elites benefit more than the wider population.
Okay, we've mapped out the system, the players, the money flows. Naturally, a system this big and complex draws a lot of criticism. What's fascinating is who is saying what. Let's look at the critiques, maybe starting with the Global South perspective.
Yes, and the critiques from the Global South are often much more fundamental. They don't just see aid as inefficient. They often see it as a continuation of colonial power dynamics.
A form of neocolonialism?
That's the argument some make, yes, that it perpetuates dependency. Look at the economic data. Aid-dependent countries in Africa saw tiny per capita income growth, just 0.5% year from 1980–2020, compared to 2.5% in less aid-reliant Asian economies. Dambisa Moyo, the Zambian economist, famously argued aid makes governments accountable to foreign donors, not their own people.
And the conditions attached to aid.
That's a huge issue, conditionality. Aid often comes with strings attached, forcing certain economic policies or demanding political alignment. Over 60% of aid in 2024 had non-developmental conditions, like cooperating on migration control. This is seen as undermining national sovereignty.
Plus the paternalism you mentioned earlier.
Right, the idea that Western experts have all the answers, overriding local knowledge. An ODI study found less than a quarter of aid projects were actually co-designed with local stakeholders. That leads to projects that don't fit, don't stick.
Okay, so that's a deep critique about power and dependency. What about critiques from within the global north? What do they focus on?
From the north, the criticism tends to be more about value for money, efficiency waste, return on investment. You hear politicians like Senator Rand Paul talking about aid being stolen from taxpayers, pointing to those audits showing high failure rates.
That 43% failure rate again.
Exactly. Figures like that erode public support. William Easterly critiques the bureaucracy itself, arguing aid agencies prioritize their own survival budgets, staff numbers, contracts signed over actual development results. He notes almost all USAID grants track activities, not measurable outcomes.
And the high overhead costs.
That's another major northern critique. Why do projects run by international groups cost 20–25% in overhead, when local groups might manage with 10–15%? It fuels skepticism, and you see it in opinion polls. Support for foreign aid drops significantly in the U.S., down to 40% by 2025.
So it seems like both sides agree the system isn't working perfectly, but for different reasons.
There's definitely convergence on the idea that the system is misaligned. The incentives are wrong. It prioritizes short-term visible outputs over building long-term local resilience.
But they diverge on the solutions.
Completely. The South tends to call for radical changes. Untying all aid, respecting sovereignty, maybe shifting towards regional or South models. The North often focuses on technical fixes, better oversight, more results-based payments, stronger auditing. Different diagnoses lead to different prescriptions.
Which brings us back to the fundamental question, given all this, does aid actually work? The case studies really seem to highlight the complexities here.
They do. They show it's rarely a simple yes or no.
Let's take Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. Huge pledges, $13.5 billion. Aid definitely prevented mass starvation.
Yes, the immediate humanitarian response was vital. But the longer-term picture, pretty grim. Remember the American Red Cross story? $500 million raised, they built just 6 permanent homes.
6 homes, that's unbelievable.
And a report suggested up to 25% of funds went to international staff costs and overhead. You had over 10,000 NGOs flooding the country, working independently, often bypassing the Haitian government entirely.
A republic of NGOs.
Exactly. It fragmented efforts, undermined the state. 10 years later, poverty was still incredibly high.
Yeah.
So massive aid influx, but limited sustainable development. For you, the listener, Haiti shows how coordination failure and sidelining local actors can doom recovery efforts no matter how much money is thrown at the problem.
Okay, contrast that with Afghanistan, 2002-2021, $145 billion in civilian aid. There were gains, right? School enrollment, health improvement.
Yeah, school enrollment went from 1 million to over 9 million, a huge increase. Infant mortality dropped significantly. These are real achievements.
Yeah.
But the whole system was built on external aid. By 2020, aid funded 75% of the government's budget. Total dependency.
So when the U.S. pulled out,
the whole house of cards collapsed.
Yeah.
GDP plummeted 20% almost overnight. Poverty shot up to 97%.
Yeah.
And corruption was rampant throughout the 2 decades. Estimates suggest 15–30% of aid simply vanished into graft.
Wow. So aid tied to military goals created a fragile, dependent state that couldn't survive on its own.
Essentially, yes. It highlights the dangers of externally driven state building, where local institutions and revenue generation aren't prioritized.
What about Malawi? You mentioned it earlier as highly aid-dependent.
Right. Aid often covers 40% of the national budget. And again, there are successes. Huge improvements in health, under 5 mortality dropped 60% since 2000. Aid has averted famines.
So it saves lives.
Undeniably. But economically, growth has been stagnant around 1.5% a year. Poverty is stuck at 70%. And then you had the Cashgate scandal in 2013, $32 million in donor money embezzled, showing how aid can get sucked into patronage systems.
And it substitutes for government functions?
That's the argument. If donors are funding health and education, there's less pressure on the government to raise its own taxes. Malawi's tax-to-GDP ratio is well below regional averages. So aid keeps essential services running, but potentially hinders long-term institutional development.
But it's not all negative. South Korea is the classic success story, isn't it?
It really is. Between 1953 and 1975, it received about $12.7 billion, mostly from the U.S. Crucially, this aid was integrated into South Korea's own national development plans. Strong government leadership, focus on education, industrial policy,
and the result?
Rapid economic growth, literacy soared. By 1995, South Korea didn't need aid anymore. By 2010, it had become a significant donor itself.
So what's the common thread in these stories? What makes the difference?
It seems pretty clear. Aid can be vital in a crisis. But for long-term development, it's not enough on its own. Success hinges on strong local ownership, alignment with national strategies, and building robust domestic institutions. When aid bypasses or replaces those things, results are often unsustainable. For you, the takeaway is How aid is delivered and who is in charge matters just as much, maybe more, than the dollar amount.
Okay, so let's really try to net this out. Successes versus failures. Where has aid clearly delivered?
Well, in specific targeted areas, the impact is undeniable. Health is a huge one. PEPFAR, the U.S. HIV/AIDS program, 17 million people on treatment, 60% cut in deaths. Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, 900 million kids immunized. Smallpox eradication cost $300 million, saved maybe 300 million lives. Incredible return.
Hard to argue with those results.
Absolutely. And in humanitarian relief, aid is critical. Somalia famine in 2011, $1.5 billion helped avert mass starvation. Indian Ocean tsunami response, housing rebuilt relatively quickly. Disaster deaths are way down in countries receiving consistent aid.
Infrastructure, too.
Yes, infrastructure and growth. Indonesia's highways, funded partly by aid loans, boosted GDP. The Green Revolution in Asia, supported by external funding, transformed agriculture, averted massive famines. Ethiopia's investments in energy and roads, partly aid-funded, underpinned years of strong growth.
And education and gender.
Big strides. School enrollment jumped 50% in sub-Saharan Africa with aid support. Illiteracy fell. Microfinance, often kick-started by aid, reached 200 million women, boosting incomes. So, cumulatively, aid has contributed to lifting billions out of extreme poverty. But, and it's a big but, the failures and shortcomings are just as real and persistent.
Like the dependency issue, the aid curse.
Right. Malawi's 40% budget dependence, stagnant growth. Evidence suggests high aid levels can reduce a government's tax collection efforts by 10–15%. They rely on donors instead of building their own revenue base.
And the corruption and elite capture we saw in Malawi and Afghanistan.
It's a constant vulnerability. Money gets diverted, benefits get concentrated among the connected few, worsening inequality.
Then the misaligned incentives paying for activities, not results.
Exactly. That 43% failure rate with full payment, high overheads for international groups, Easterly's critique of top-down planners, imposing blueprints that don't work locally, it all points to a system not optimizing for impact.
And sometimes just plain unintended negative consequences.
Yeah. Food aid undercutting local farmers. Aid inadvertently fueling conflict by providing resources warring factions can capture. Even well-intentioned programs facing cultural pushback. It's complex terrain.
This really gets to the heart of the big debate, doesn't it? Sachs versus Easterly.
It does. Jeffrey Sachs argues for the big push that poor countries need massive, coordinated aid influxes to escape poverty traps, pointing to successes like PEPFAR. William Easterly counters forcefully, critiquing the top-down planner approach. He argues trillions in aid haven't significantly boosted growth in many places, blaming detached bureaucratic strategies.
But micro-level studies show some things do work well.
Yes, things like distributing insecticide-treated bed nets for malaria, or simple direct cash transfers to poor families, these often show clear, positive, cost-effective results. The Paris Declaration tried to embed principles like local ownership back in 2005, but implementation proved really difficult. So for you, the question isn't just does aid work, it's more like which types of aid work, under what conditions, and who gets to decide.
That feels like a much more productive question. Which brings us to the current moment, this disruption, this 2025 inflection point. It's forcing change, whether the system likes it or not.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
That U.S. aid freeze, the $38 billion held back or cut, sent shockwaves. UN programs suspended, big INGOs facing budget cuts of 25–40%. They had to downsize, rethink expensive operational models.
So, from a systems view, the accumulated problems finally triggered a correction.
You could see it that way. Disinvestment forcing a painful but maybe necessary reckoning. It creates space, political and financial, to explore different ways of doing things.
And what are those alternatives? What's emerging from this disruption?
Several promising pathways are getting more attention. Direct cash transfers are one. Give Directly's work in Kenya is a prime example. Efficient, respects recipient choice.
Okay.
South-South cooperation is growing. Brazil helping African nations with agriculture. India sharing tech expertise. The African Union's own Agenda 2063. Often more peer-to-peer, less top-down. Impact investing is booming private capital seeking social and environmental returns alongside financial ones. It's over $1 trillion now. Though, still a question mark over whether it reaches the very poorest.
Right.
And within the traditional aid world, you see initiatives like the Reimagining the Indigo, Ringo Project, explicitly trying to shift power to local actors, pilot truly untied aid. Early results look good, better efficiency, higher community satisfaction.
And the Pledge for Change 2030?
Yeah, dozens of organizations signing up, committing to more equitable partnerships, more direct funding to local groups. Signatories actually increased that direct local funding by 15% in 2024. So there are movements trying to reform from within.
These sound like positive steps, but
Yeah.
you keep coming back to the idea of the AIC as a complex adaptive system, good at surviving. How does that affect these reform efforts?
It's the fundamental challenge. The system is resilient. It absorbs change, adapts its language, finds workarounds. NGOs might rebrand projects to fit the latest donor buzzwords. Contractors might meet contractual outputs without achieving real change, but still get paid. The system can maintain its core power structures even while appearing to reform.
So genuine transformation isn't easy.
It requires constant vigilance, adaptive leadership, a willingness to learn and iterate, not just impose rigid plans. It means constantly pushing against the system's tendency to revert to its old ways.
So wrapping this all up, we've journeyed through this incredibly complex world of the aid industrial complex. We've seen the successes, real life saved, progress made.
Absolutely. In health, disaster relief, some areas show remarkable impact.
But we've also seen the deep-seated problems, the potential for dependency, the power imbalances, the critiques from both North and South about efficiency and sovereignty.
Right. The North often asking, is it working efficiently? The South asking, is it fundamentally just?
And this 2025 moment, this disruption, it's more than just budget cuts. It feels like a real fork in the road.
A strategic inflection point, exactly. It's forcing everyone involved to question the basic assumptions, to move beyond tinkering at the edges.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought for you, the listener.
If the underlying purpose of aid remains tangled up with donor visibility, geopolitical games, hitting short-term targets, then tweaking the tools, making it more modern or efficient, might not change the fundamental outcomes. The system might just keep reproducing the same patterns.
So the real leverage, the real question we need to ask is,
For whom is this system truly designed to work? And how do we genuinely redesign its foundations so that it serves the needs and priorities of communities first and foremost, not the institutional needs or political agendas driving it from afar?
that's a powerful question to ponder. This deep dive has really only scratched the surface, but hopefully it's given you a framework for thinking about these dynamics.
And maybe encourages you to look at other areas of global engagement, trade, climate finance, diplomacy, and ask similar questions about who holds the power and who truly benefits.
What would it really take to shift that power? Something to think about.